All right, so friends, let's get ready on the War of 1812. I absolutely love lecturing on this program. If anybody sees a theme with what I lecture on, I tend to lecture on the not so sexy genealogy subjects like the War of 1812 and World War I. But here was my deal. When I started working off with the War of 1812, it was trying to get my grandmother into the Daughters of the American Revolution. There are just certain things you've got to do, and when your grandmother, who's almost 90, says, I want to join the DIR, I want to be, in this organization, it's on my, bucket list. I took the challenge, I said, challenge accepted, and I went off to go find my grandmother's DIR ancestors. So off to go do some research. And here's the goal, guys. So you can kind of see this is my grandmother's people. And we have to follow, of course, methodology going back and back and back until we get to that patriot. And we have to fill in the blanks of all of the information that we have. So the ancestor I knew that she had, George Vandiver, then his son, Adam Poole Vandiver, Alexander Vandiver, Marcus de Lafayette Vandiver, for any of you Hamilton fans out there. Yes, Marcus de Lafayette Vandiver, super stoked about that one. And then of course too, Amicus and Azzy Abernathy. But as it sits, when I looked at what we have to go with as far as a black hole of records, at least in northern Georgia, where my family is from, where literacy is not always top notch, where record keeping can be very, very spotty. I mean, if you're down from Savannah or Augusta, you're in a pretty good place emotionally with records. But as you reach into the interiors and up into the Blue Ridge Mountains, where my family is from, our availability of records becomes much smaller. And I did a timeline, because this is important. Whenever you're working on a black hole subject, or you're looking at a brick wall and saying, what are my options? I had to start looking at what type of records were available for the place that I was researching with, and what could I do to get further back. And this is just to illustrate the availability of records I had. And notice that once you get back to the 1780s and 1833 time period, so that Revolutionary War time period, there's a ton of really great information. But as time actually moves forward in time, you have fewer and fewer options, especially for that area and that time period. And I said, okay, well, we've got these census, which really isn't helping me, some probate, some wills, maybe some land and legal records, which normally could break open a case, but for me isn't really helping out at all. What we have is military service, and military service with a question mark, because I hadn't really done a lot of research on military service. Then I found this on Pinterest, which next month I'm going to be giving a presentation on pinning your genealogical past together with Pinterest. But Pinterest is great because it had this family tree graphic that illustrates the birth years of veterans. And when I saw this, it was fantastic, because it lays out not only George Vandiver at that, there's that Revolutionary War birth period, but then I kind of put my ancestors and plug them into those time periods for those other wars. Now, these do not illustrate at all the smaller Indian wars or Indian conflicts that you'll see throughout history. Because remember, do you guys see the first, second, and third Seminole Wars in here? No, you don't see them. Do you see anything that has any of the Indian removal wars in here? No. Do you see do you see some of the other conflicts or skirmishes in here? No, you don't see any of that. You just see like the major hits. Like if you had a Rick Deves, top 10, here it is. But all of the other smaller conflicts are there. But when I looked at this and said, okay, Alexander Vandiver, I know he probably wasn't in the Civil War, but he's old enough, and he could have been in the Mexican War. I'll go look for that. But Adam Poole Vandiver hit very, very firmly during the War of 1812, and he's too old to serve in some of the other Indian wars. So I'm like, okay, let's go after this guy. Let's go see what we can find. Now, that opened up a whole nother realm of what the War of 1812 means, because most of us think about it as a land war, but that's not necessarily the case. There's multiple arenas of the War of 1812, and our history books don't ever really talk about it very much. They'll talk about the burning of Washington. They'll talk about Old Ironsides. They'll, you know, they'll talk about the Star Spangled Banner. You know, they'll talk about those, but there's a whole lot that gets left out. And part of it, especially where we're here in Illinois, the Northwest Territories and, you know, Northwestern University here in Chicago was because at one point, this was the Northwest of the United States before we went out and manifested that destiny. That's where we get Northwestern University from. So when we look at the skirmishes that are happening near the Canadian border, which for people who have ancestors in Michigan, Ohio, New York, Maine, and areas along the St. Lawrence Seaway, your ancestor could have been part of the Canadian border conflicts that were happening during the War of 1812. Like my ancestor who went down to serve in the Creek War in Alabama. He's from Georgia, so they send essentially the expendables with muskets and probably who don't smell terribly great to go out and wage war in Mississippi and Alabama and areas of Florida, and then eventually into New Orleans. Then you have the East Coast, which is where we get people from Philadelphia and Boston and Maryland and Virginia and the coastal Carolinas are all fighting out on the East Coast with blockades and invasions. And then up here with the Northwest Territories, we have the conflicts of First Peoples, of the Native peoples who were working in conjunction with the British and causing a muck. And that's where we get the burning of places like Fort Dearborn, which is on one of the stars on our Chicago flag. So, you know, these are the really real possibilities of all of these places. So when you look at your ancestors geographically at that time period, if you can put them in one of these places, that's going to help you identify what type of service that they performed and what type of records are available to you. We're also forgetting that the War of 1812 is a naval war. It's a naval war that we really don't talk about. I know that if you're from Ohio, like my family lived in Cleveland for a long time, that you'll always hear about the Battle of Lake Erie. It's actually one of our best stories out of the War of 1812 is how this ragtag group of Americans fought this huge battle out on Lake Erie. It's amazing. It's a great, great battle and it's a great, great story. Same thing with Lake Champlain if you have ancestors in New York. But there's also the naval battles in Boston Harbor, the naval battles in the river, the Rappahannock River, and then the naval battles at sea, not only the USS Constitution and near Halifax, but we also have places near Madeira in Spain, in Maine, the Azores, Brazil, Chile, like all of these places, all of these conflicts make it the realm and the world of the War of 1812 so much bigger. Do you guys kind of see how like our understanding and like the geography of the War of 1812 just got bigger? And your ancestors may have been part of that. So we're going to track down some of the things that they've gone through today. But I'm going to give a little shout out to the Creek War for the War of 1812, because technically it wasn't part of the War of 1812, but they ended up rolling it into, which is why they have pension records for people who fought in the Creek War from 1813 to 1814. And as you'll see that they basically, the government said, well, we don't really have troops to like send down to places like Alabama and really go help out. So we're going to ask for these groups of men, really hardcore mountain men. We're going to send them into a place where they can fend for themselves, hunt for themselves, take care of themselves, and go out, kick butt, take names, and fight against the Red Stick Creek with our allies who are also Creek and Cherokee. And unfortunately, that ended up being the real losers when we think about how the War of 1812 was a stalemate for the United States and for Britain, and ended up being catastrophic, a loss and a catastrophic defeat for the Native peoples, because they ended up losing quite a bit of not only succeeding a lot of their land to the United States, but also losing their own men in the service of the United States as well. So those were the real losers of the War of 1812. So as we get into those, if you have an ancestor from Alabama or Georgia or Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, it's well taking a look at to see if they served in the Creek War at any time. So the records that they have left behind, all of this is in your handout. This is going through not only wartime records, because we don't want to look at just pension records. I know a lot of us went through and we raised money for that, preserved the pensions for the War of 1812. Do you guys remember that? Like good times. Like stood at the silent auction table raising money, and I love it. I love raising money for genealogy records. but the pensions are not the end all be all. And if you've had some frustrations researching the War of 1812 because you're like, oh, they didn't receive a pension, you're missing that there's so many other records that are available to you. We're just gonna, you maybe not just don't know where to start. So start by looking at what the wartime records are available and the post-war records that are available. And I gave you a little cheat list. And we're gonna go through some of these as we go through. But remember that service is not only just from the person, but it's also from the point of view of the widows and the children. For the land bounty records, it's also through the community that keeps tabs on the people who served during the War of 1812, and maybe have memorialized them through a book or a publication or a monument inside of a church. So there's a lot of different things going on here and a lot of good ways that you guys can start tracking down records. So, but I always want to caution you guys, remember, do you have the right guy? I always want to keep this in mind. Whenever you're peeling back the layers of history, remember that you can't just jump into military research with a name and a place location. You're going to want to make sure that you are able to confirm the identity with local, state, and if they've got them some sort of federal record, that's not always the case, but just to do a reasonably exhaustive search, a reasonably cohesive search that makes sure that you're ticking off as many boxes, you're going through as many resources as possible, and that you're identifying people. And not everybody is Hiram Cronk, who was the last surviving veteran of the War of 1812. I mean, not everybody could be him. And find not only his likeness in a newspaper article, but also find a lot of information on him because he was the last veteran. So if your ancestor was not one of the last surviving U.S. veterans of the War of 1812, it doesn't mean that your research is impossible. It just means it might be a little bit more rigorous. And the rigorous, it's just like when you're working out. Rigorous research makes you a better researcher. So we're all gonna have a good time together. But I also want you guys to be aware of something called land bounty and pension law. And this is important. This is a little cheat sheet I made for you based on pension law for the War of 1812. And that made sure that the veterans of the War of 1812, the government couldn't, we're kind of scrapped for cash. We're a scrappy, hungry little new country, and we don't exactly have a lot of money to give people. So being very, very aware of that, the government offered bounty land warrants. And this is where you're actually going to get the best success for a lot of people who served in the War of 1812, because you were eligible to get double land bounty warrants starting as early as 1814. So where we think, oh man, the 1810 census are tick marks, and this is a tick mark and this is that. No, land bounty warrants are the place to be, because you still have to provide information to be able to get that land bounty warrant, and they start as early as 1814. Now, bounty land does branch out much later. 30 years later, bounty land can be claimed on any public domain land. By 1855, land is awarded for people who have performed 14 days of service, and widows are eligible for that. Then that's where we get that 1871 pension or bounty land for 60 days of service. And that's where most people look at those preserve the pensions. If you've lived to 1871, you can claim your pension. But remember, they waited till a lot of people were dead until you could get this pension. And then included widows if they were married before a certain time period. And then after 1878, it was for all widows, regardless of when they were married to their husbands. So having this, guys, not all veterans claim their bounty land. And if you go through Adjutant General's records for each individual state, like I just did that, it not only covers War of 1812, but for us, it also covers the Black Hawk War. So if you're going through land bounty records for the state of Illinois, you can actually find them in the 1850s, and you'll see like a slew of people never claimed their bounty land. They were alive, but they never claimed it. But they'll still be listed in those Adjutant General's records for the state if your land bounty state is available, like Illinois. So it's a great place, a little double dipping there for Black Hawk War veterans. But let's go for what's available where. This is all in your handout. So what are we going to take a look at? Well, some of it we're going to go through in Fold 3, some of it's at the National Archives, some of it's on Ancestry, and I tried really hard to make sure that you guys had access to what's where, because if you're like me, I have a private Ancestry account, but I also have Fold 3 through my library, and I'm able to get that from home. And you might want to check with your local library right now, because they might be offering Ancestry for free through the end of May, because of our current health pandemic that we're experiencing. And if your library might also be subscribing to Fold 3, and you might be able to get that from home as well. So a couple of things that you might only have to kind of worry that might be a little bit of a time period or a time crunch or a time, a place like you feel like you're in timeout, is from the National Archives, because they're not open. So we gotta give them some slack. So a couple things. So Judy asked, where do you find Adjutant General's records for the state? So Judy, depending on the state, most of them will be in Ancestry. You also can find them on Google Books. You can find them on Google Books. You can find them on HathiTrust. You can find them in Internet Archive. So really, really good stuff. So remember that every state and Adjutant General's records are basically the military files for that particular state, and they have them going back to just after the Revolutionary War. So like the stuff that I found for the Black Hawk War in 1832 about the land bounty records came in, and like they were published them in 1857, and then again in 1880. So they're all typed, and they're fine, and they're great. So just use them. Yeah, no problem. So Tim says the state archives maintains about 370 different record series pertaining to 10 different Illinois land districts and federal offices. So thank you, Tim. Yes, and the state website can take care of that. So any estimate on the rest of the pensions will be finished? Well, Kathy, around the time that my mother signs my 4th grade report card. So I don't know what the holdup is. I don't work there. If anybody works for the National Archives and wants to chime in, you're more than welcome to. But my ancestor's last name is V for Vandiver. So I had to go get mine because I'm not waiting anymore. Anyway, so here's what we've got. So here's what's available where. This is all in your handout. Wanted to make sure you guys had that. Here we go. So here's locating records online. This is also in your handout. This is like a little cheat sheet. This is not everything. I like to give you guys a lot because I like you guys to see your options. We're not going to go through every single one of these, but sometimes just seeing a checklist makes this whole experience feel like, yes, I can do this. I want you guys to feel empowered by doing this. I think a couple of the ones that are on here, you guys will notice there is some overlap between Fold 3 and Ancestry, which works because Fold 3 is owned by Ancestry, but there's certain things on Fold 3 that you can't get on Ancestry, which is why Fold 3 is so important. I know some people have some real issues with Fold 3. If you go to our, if you join our Facebook page and if you look at our blog, we did a program on Fold 3 last month. And that will help you kind of use Fold 3 a little bit more. And that's a free webinar. You guys can watch that. So that's a great place I want you to go. Now, a couple things on Ancestry as well. State-specific items. So remember that Ancestry isn't just about national records as much as it is like individual records. And who takes the prize award for state-specific research is Ohio, is New York, amazingly, New Jersey, Vermont, and Maine. Now, there's a couple other ones as well, but the list of pensioners from Vermont from the War of 1812 is amazing, and it's a great resource if you have any Vermont ancestors. And then FamilySearch, of course, has a ton of stuff, but it's not indexed. So if I could put that on a t-shirt, found it on FamilySearch, it's not indexed yet or something, I think would be a big money maker. If anybody wants, is trying to look for a second career there as designing t-shirts, but ton of really good stuff. You just have to be patient. It's just like using microfilm, guys. Like we all had to go use the old microfilm machines. That's what you're doing, but you're doing from home in your bunny slippers. So this is the research strategy I want you guys to use. This is if you don't have a pension. So if your ancestor didn't live to 1871, this is the methodology I want you guys to use. You're going to go through those Army enlistments, the War of 1812 discharge certificates, the War of 1812 Army records, the War of 1812 land bounty records, all of that. And if you have a pension, you're going to do all of that plus go through and get your pension record. Now, V for Vandiver, I had to go in person to get mine. You can't do that right now because National Archives is closed, but it will be your little field trip to go find that record if it's not available online. So let's take a look at Fold 3, and this is why I love Fold 3, guys. Not everybody believes me, but there is a record set on Fold 3 called Army Enlistments. Enlistments is because when we start looking at drafts, so like World War I, that's where we're drafting people. Same thing with Civil War. That's when we start the draft. But remember that places like the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 and some of the other Indian wars where you're not militia, you're an enlisted man, these records are online and they're full of details, especially for the War of 1812. So what I also love about this, guys, on the left, up in the little box that you'll see on the page, you'll see that there's an index area, a little index button that you can push, and you can see everybody's typeset name on the page. So you know exactly what you're looking at on the page instead of trying to decipher. You get that little cheat index on the side. On each Army enlistment for this time period will be an enlistee name, a rank, a regiment, a commanding officer, the regimental commander, and then their details. And let's take a look at those details real quick. So I've got the 3 carpenters here, almost like a band, right? The 3 carpenters. I have Abner, Absalom, and Alfred, right? Abner, it gives us their height, how tall they are. How many other records from the time period can tell you how tall somebody is from that time period, right? Because we all shrink. If you're like my dad, he shrunk 2 inches. But here he is. He's 5'6½". What color is their eyes? What color is their hair? What color is their complexion? How old are they? What occupation did they have before the war? And where were they born? This is basically giving you a snapshot of that person during that time period. And people do not use these Army enlistment records. It blows my mind, especially when you're trying to connect those dots and get back to a Revolutionary War ancestor, or you're trying to connect the dots and find out where collateral ancestors are. Finding out where somebody is born is absolutely essential. And in this case, the 2 people, Abner and Alfred, they give you where they're from. Absalom, not so much. He just says Kentucky. He just says Kentucky, that's it. He's just says Kentucky and we're done. So, you can't make every ancestor spill their guts when they're filling this information out, but the information they give you is still exceptionally helpful. Like, I'm feeling good that I'm 2 inches taller than Absalom right now, so I'm feeling pretty good about myself. Now, also on this is their service details. So we've got their enlistment date, where they're born, where they're enlisted by whom, the period or duration, and most of it will say the war. They enlisted for the war. They enlisted for 5 years. They enlisted for 3 years. They enlisted for 30 days, whatever it is. And then you get this little summary of their details. So even if somebody does not survive to be able to give a pension, you're still getting a summary of their service details in their enlistment record. So why you're not using this is crazy. So we're going to take a look at that like super fast, because I wanted you guys to be able to see it. I'm a person who believes that you should be able to see this. So let's take a look at the first line for Abner. Abner gives this information, and in it, it says, at Fort Greene, he was here from this day, he died on this day or on this day, and he also appears having deserted. So there's a little bit of a mystery there for somebody from Abner Carpenter's family, saying that he's at the camp at this time, but he died on this date, but he deserted. Like, we need to do some more research. Let's go find this. Look at Absalom. He's on the second line down. He's in yellow. And it says that he was discharged at Forest and Dusky on this date. His term expired, see pension case. So that should tell you that we've got some sort of pension somewhere. So let's go find it. And then Alfred at the bottom, he says that on July 31st, 1816, on command in pursuit of deserters. So he was the guy who was enlisted for 5 years. So he has a lot more meat in his military file. And he's one of those guys going down and pursuing people who skipped out on their enlistment. So a lot of really good information in these Army enlistments that are on Fold 3. Here's one as an example, because I wanted you guys to see. I actually ran across this guy. This was so great. I couldn't believe it. This is Daniel HUMM. And people think that, okay, my ancestor never served beyond a 12-mile radius of where they lived. No, that's completely not true. So here's David HUMM. He enlisted in 1814 in Greersburg, Pennsylvania, and served during the Revolutionary War. He's discharged near Buffalo, New York in 1815. It gives us all of his wonderful details. He's very tall, gray eyes, brown hair, probably nice looking guy, and he's a laborer. He just says he's born in Virginia. Not terribly helpful, but let's go find this guy. This is his discharge certificate. Now remember, you can get some of these online, but you can send away for the originals. If they're not online, you can get them from the National Archives. And this is just an example of this. So it gives everything from his rank to his commander, how tall he is, how high he is. This is the important part of his discharge. You guys see the yellow box? All right. It tells you that he traveled from Buffalo and his place of discharge to Bradford, I think it was Bedford, and that he was being the distance of 300 miles, and that he's reserved the following articles in uniform clothing, that he had one hat and one coat and 2 vests and 2 pantaloons and 4 shirts. You guys get to see what kind of clothes he was issued before he left, and that his bounty was paid. So and this is from Buffalo. So when he finished his work in Buffalo, he still had to walk 300 miles back to Bedford, or rode his horse or whatever he possibly had. But you guys see that this is a guy from Virginia who enlists in Pennsylvania, goes to Buffalo, New York to serve, and then he ends up going to Bedford, back to Bedford, Pennsylvania, which incidentally, when we take a look at his land bounty application request, it gives all of this information and still gives his affidavit, and I could apply for the full land bounty record from the National Archives. That's just his discharge certificate. Most of those you can get online. But now that I have his land bounty stuff, I can send away for the land bounty, and it's going to give me even more information about this guy. And you guys want to know what he looked like? Something like this. We have not only what he looks like, what he wore, the information that he went, that he performed honorable service, but the place, Bedford, Pennsylvania, where he ended up living, there's a museum and they have one of his guns. Now, I'm just saying, this is like, this never happens to me in my family, right? That's what you guys are all saying. This never happens to me in my family. But I'm giving you that this is somebody who traveled widely. Your ancestor is not as immobile as you think, especially during a war period. They're trying to send people wherever they possibly can. And he dies before the pensions in 1871. But I have so much information about him now. This is well in my ticket. And I'm just saying, back me up here if anybody's in the Daughters of the American or Daughters of the War of 1812. Like, this is the information that they need, and this is the information that can get you into that heritage organization, but infinitely more than you guys thought, right? Because I'm feeling some minds were just blown on that one, especially with the gun. Everybody loves that one. They're like, they have his gun. Yes, they have his gun. It's in like in a stockade looking museum thing in Bedford. I was going to go at some point. So how about research strategy for people who served in the Navy, right? So that we just did land guy. Now we're going to do Navy guy. So do I have a pension? Yes or no? No pension? Here are your options. All of this is, we're still going to get the discharge certificate. We're still going to get the land bounty records. We're still going to get the service records. Do you guys see that there's a lot of meat here? You do get extra credit because we're going to go into things like casualty reports, War of 1812 papers, seamen certificates, because I think Judy from Algonquin emailed me earlier this week, and she said, well, I've got an ancestor who was in Dartmoor. Oh, don't worry, Judy, we're getting there. But here's some of the records we're going to go through. Plus, if they live to get a pension, yes, we're going to get the pension file. So why you guys aren't doing more of this research is beyond me. So let's take a look at prisoner of war records, because these are by far some of my favorite records to go through. They're all free. They're all on FamilySearch. Now, if your ancestor was doesn't matter if they were in the Navy or not. So they could have been a Navy, they could have been a merchant vessel, whatever have you. Remember, this is naval warfare. And if you're flying a certain flag, you know, both countries at this time, because of of relations. The British could board an American ship, the Americans could board a British ship, and they're going to keep prisoners, they're going to cartel prisoners, they're going to, in the case of the Americans, we're going to seize British goods, and we're going to essentially become like pirates with a hall pass and keep all your goods and stuff. So, you know, there's a lot of this going on at sea. So if your ancestors have any connection to the sea or a port town or the Navy, you're going to want to check out these prisoner of war records. They're not indexed, unfortunately, but you can go through you can go by ship. And if you really are looking for like a list of engagements, and this will be in their service file. In their service file, they'll say what ship they served on, the Chesapeake, or they were serving on the Boyd, or they're serving on the Globe, whatever it is, they're serving on this ship. Then you can go through and see if that ship was ever captured. You go through and see if that ship is captured, and here is one of the instances. So this is the USS Chesapeake, which was boarded and conquered by the HMS Shannon. So on the left, you'll see what is the name of the ship, and these are British records, which is great. So they have the day that the person was taken into custody, where at sea, what was the name of the ship, the Chesapeake, what type of ship is it, and this is a man of war, so this is a naval ship. The prisoners' names, their quality, which means are they Navy, Army, when were they taken into custody, by which ship, were they exchanged, discharged, died, or escaped. For the most part, they were discharged. They'll normally put died. And it's weird having two D's there, but they'll put died, D-I-E-D. They don't just leave a D. D is for discharged. What time, and then by what order. Most of the time, these guys are going to be swapped out for other people, and they're just on like a prisoner exchange ship, and they're not in custody terribly long. However, I do want to make this very well known that not only American sailors, but French sailors were housed not only in prison ships in England, but they were also housed in Edinburgh Castle. So as a prisoner of war, you could have been shipped to multiple places and not necessarily valuable enough for a prisoner exchange. So this is a whole nother aspect of research that, of course, takes your ancestors thousands of miles sometimes from where they're from. Here's another one. So this is, in this instance, this is a merchant vessel. This is the HMS Belvedere, which I cannot pronounce, but they find an American merchant vessel called the Fortune, and they take that over. And then here you see the prisoners' names that they're in the Navy, or they're the captain or whatever have you, when they're taken into custody, and then what happens to them. And you'll see some of them are, again, prisoner exchanges. But this is a non-violent merchant vessel. This is a merchant vessel that's out there just trading goods, you know, doing their thing, and then they get boarded by a British ship. So your ancestor, even if they don't have a Navy background, still could be caught up in this prisoner of war area. So I always try to tell people, that to look at these records. Do POW records mention slaves who escaped the British ships? Yes, they can in some aspects, Joseph. So I think that is a good one to keep in mind. But remember that especially with New England, if your African-American ancestor was from like Nantucket or Boston or whatever have you, that African-American sailors received the same amount of pay, and they were treated the same as like on a same thing on a Navy ship, that there isn't that difference, even though there in reality is a very different thing. But yes, they will have some account, and if there are any slaves who decide to join a British ship, they're more than welcome to. There are some instances of that, though I still need to do some more research on it because it looks like a lot of fun. Okay, so where were we? I went on a little further on that. So yeah, okay, great. So I just need, for full disclosure, that yes, there are a ton of records that are available on FamilySearch, and they're free. With that in mind, there are some records available from the National Archives in Q. However, they cost money. Like, I'm really sorry, they cost money. So if you have an ancestor or know of an ancestor, these are searchable. These are searchable where the ones on FamilySearch are not. So it's up to you whether or not you feel that is worth your time and money to subscribe to the National Archives and Q to go through and search these records as opposed to paging through them on FamilySearch for free. But I have to throw it out there because that's what's important. And these are just the prison ships and depots that are in Dartmoor, Portsmouth, Chatham, you know, there's a ton of these. And then there's additional like ships logs that you can get from these ships at the National Archives, which talk about the captain taking on prisoners or what happened that day on the ship from the British perspective. And if you guys are into that, go get those from the National Archives in Kew. Go get them. My friend Audrey works there. She will help you. It's amazing. And if you need her contact information, let me know. So Fold 3 has a Navy casualty list, which is also important. Remember how we talked about the Chesapeake earlier? So they have a casualty report which lists the people who died during that scuffle. Now it's listing 3, but there might have been more. So, you know, these are not always 100%, you know, 100% ready to go for you, but there's some information on the casualty reports. And sometimes they end up being a good way to double check what you see in a service record or a pension. So they'll not only have men who died in station in action, men who died on vessels, deaths due to enemy action, all of those are under an area in Fold 3, but they have some lost and wrecked ships, explosion and steam casualties, and those go from 1801 to 1941. So if you have any ancestors who served in the Navy, this is a great resource on Fold 3, and a lot of their records are typeset. And if they're not, they also provide that little index button so you can see a transcription of everybody's name. So Fold 3 just really hits the ball out of the ballpark on this one. Now, remember when we talked about what it's like, we can't just go out and grab information that, yes, they served on the Chesapeake, and yes, they were a prisoner of war, right? When we start getting more of that information, we need to fill in with the historical context, and we need to fill in with the story, because this is the story that entrances like the kids, right? This is the stuff that people want to hear about. They want to hear about the sea battles, because already they're envisioning like a master and commander, Russell Crowe, you know, Paul Bettany sort of situation. So we're going to give that to them, right? We're going to give them that moment. And if you go to the Naval History and Heritage Command website, they have a slew of different historical essays that are about specific War of 1812 battles. They tell you everything down to what it smelled like on the ship, the blood that's gushing out everywhere, the gunners, how big the guns were, how big the cannonballs would go, like all of that stuff. And it's completely free. So please go here and look at some of these descriptions, because even though your ancestor may not have been on the Chesapeake at that time period, at least look and see what the type of guns that they're carrying, what the ship looked like, how it was outfitted, how many people are on there. All that information is going to be on these Heritage Command sites. Now, another thing I want you guys to go through, and I've got a couple questions. So D.L. Klein, yes, National Archives, she has some downloads. Yes, oh yes, you're right. So D.L. Klein, yes, there are some records that are free on the National Archives in Kew through the end of the month. I wasn't sure which ones they had. The last time I checked, they were Scottish records. So thanks for reminding everybody of that. I will put that in a link also on the Facebook page when I post it later today. So thanks, appreciate that. And I think they also had, yeah, we took care of that. Okay, great. All right, so thanks for the website, DL Klein. I really appreciate it. Okay, so here's another one I want you guys to go through. Remember those pesky vital records that people keep looking for, and mentions of prisoner of war records and whatever have you? So I want you guys to go through on FamilySearch the War of 1812 papers from the Department of State. And what you will find inside of them is correspondence between the American ambassadors and the British ambassadors, or in this instance, reports of William Lambert, secret agent, which really needs to be a book. I just think so. That they're talking about that these are people who are Americans and they were on a ship, and you know, we're trying to get them brought home, that, you know, their families are telling them they need to be brought home. We can provide proof of American citizenship. And citizenship during the War of 1812 is super weird, because we haven't really, like, what is it to be an American? Like, we don't, you're not required to take an oath of allegiance. You know, you're not required to like go through a citizenship process. Citizenship was super wonky, and it was super weird, especially for people like, how do you prove that you're an American citizen, you know? So in this instance, family members who were trying to get loved ones or friends or family off British, out of the British prison ships that were in England, they had been taken captive, they would send, and in this instance, they say, okay, there's this young man who's on the ship. They would send letters that say this young man is on the ship and that he is he's on a ship called the Crown Prince Frederick in Chatham, England, and that he's been here. The last letter we received from him was from March 3rd, 1814. So when we take a look at inside the letter was a notary copy of the person who had actually baptized him. So he says, we can prove his American citizenship, like we want him home. He's not a British subject, he's an American. They, you know, loved ones would go to a notary, go to the minister, go to whoever, and the notary would then take down the information about the individual that they had been, yes, I can attest that I baptized this child, and that this child is the son of so-and-so. And here it is, Thomas, the son of Jenkins Williams and Elizabeth Williams, his wife of Norwich, both of them deceased. What does that tell us? Both of them deceased. So as of this day in 1814, both of his parents are dead. I baptized him on this day at this church. So what else do we know about him? Well, he's from Norwich. We know that he's there. We know his parents died around that area, and that we know that his family, if there's any other church records, would be there. But this notarized copy of his birth is in these War of 1812 papers that were exchanged between the American government and the British government. So finding this proof of birth is another reason why we need to go through these records, because that church could have burned down. We could have had no records from Norwich in that area. But in these records between the governments, two governments, we're able to find this. Really good stuff. Now, this is another one I love, which is prize case files. Now, remember that even though you've been given a hall pass to go out and kick butt, take names, seize British items, you know, Americans, well, we're trying to prove that this isn't real piracy because it's going to go through a district court. So if your ancestor was part of a group of people who decided to go out and, you know, take over British ships in the name of the American government, that their records, at least for Pennsylvania and Southern New York, are online on FamilySearch. And I'm giving you these two documents because the one on the left is for a ship called the Boyd. That when a ship was seized by the Americans, it kept all of the paperwork that proved that this ship was a British ship. And I mean every piece of paper that proved this was a British ship. So this is the Royal Charter, which gave this ship, the Boyd, permission to go around and to trade. And it also leaves little trails of like, oh, they were in France, they were in Cuba, they were in Brazil, they were in this country. And then when it's seized by the Americans, notice what's on the right in the Articles of Agreement. This is the ship list, which gives the share that each individual man is going to make. So if you're the commander, you get 16 shares. If you're the first mate, you get, 6 shares. If you're an able seaman, you get 2 shares. Do you think that they leave anybody out? No. Look at these guys, all right? So on the left, it lists every single person who's on the ship who's eligible for a share. And it also lists the names of people who had just been brought on but are not eligible for shares. So notice we have Adam Hill, a cook's mate, he gets 2 shares. John Brown, an ordinary sailor, he gets a share. William Tyler, same thing, he gets a half share. The ship's boy gets half a share. And so does the other ship's boy. He actually gets a full share. So he might have been older, or he might have been on the ship earlier. But these are records that pertain to every person who is on that ship. And if your ancestor is seizing this information, their names are going to be put on these sheets, and you're able to see how much of a share that they're receiving. But this is actually a very small way we actually get to find children that are involved in this sort of service to the country, if you will. So I would have to talk to some of the ladies who were in charge of the War of 1812 to see if young children like this, who are the ship's boy, would be eligible for entry into the War of 1812 lineage societies, because we do have proof of them going out with these ships to go out and to, you know, kick butt, take names, and see ships in the name of the government. So that'll be an interesting question down the line, but I would love to write a book about the young men who are like little guys on these ships, probably about 10, 12, 13 years old, out there and seizing ships during the War of 1812. Now, this is the one I wanted Judy to see, and I'd hope that she hadn't seen it already, but this is the one I wanted the rest of you guys to see if you have ancestors with seafaring relatives. These records, the index of them are on Ancestry, but I want you guys to actually go to the actual website, which is the Mystic Seaport Museum. These are New England Seamen's Protection Certificate indexes. Remember when we talked about how we had to prove that somebody was an American citizen to be able to get them back during the War of 1812? Well, that started way before that. Remember, a lot of anger between the United States and Great Britain was impressment of American sailors into the British Navy. And you had to prove that you were an American citizen to be able to get out of that mess. So one of the things that the government did, and this started in 1896, was that the American government said, okay, we want you, if you're serving on an American vessel, that we're going to issue you the Seamen's Protection Certificate. And it vouched for the citizenship of the sailor. And it provided their height, their complexion, their birth, their eye color, their hair color. And the registry includes entries for over 30,000 people. So some of them are duplicates. And you'll see these. So in Ancestry, this is what you'll see. You'll see a Benjamin Ellsbury, his port, his age, his birth year, his birthplace, and you'll see some of this stuff, right? This is just the index. Are we happy with just looking at the index? Shake your head no. That's right. You're not happy looking at just the index. We're going to go take a look at the full record. This is what the index on the Mystic Seaport database looks like. It gives you more information, and you have the ability to scroll through and take a look at more stuff. But in this instance, guys, look at what we're seeing here, especially with the seamen that are here. We're seeing a high percentage of African Americans serving as sailors on ships. So this makes sense. It also gives you the port that somebody was from. It gives you the date that it was issued, the height of the person. And in the instance of, I have a Thomas Williams from Boston. He's 5'11". He has a scar on his right arm and his left wrist. So you're able to gather more information. Now, they also give you a certificate number. And when you contact the Mystic Seaport Museum, they'll actually like send you a digitized copy of the original certificate if you want it. And there are some people who lost their certificates. They lost them at sea. They lost them in a card fight. They might have given them to another friend, whatever it is. They would just come back into their customs house area and just ask for another copy. It didn't faze them if you needed another copy because yours got lost or whatever have you. So some people have multiple copies of these, but they kept these on file just to be able to show that, yes, that somebody has the protection of the American government behind them. So go through these. And if you have ancestors who, you have any family stories about somebody being at sea, go through these files, because I think you'll be very pleasantly surprised to see that your ancestor is on them. It's also a great way to really take a look at some of those seafaring records that we don't look at. I'm going to run through briefly through the War of 1812 or through the Indian War records from the War of 1812 that we kind of conveniently slam in there. So like I explained a little earlier, the Indian War records, or the Creek War as some people will call it, basically was like the Expendables. We're sending people into some very inhospitable places, using a lot of people who were already accustomed to living off the land, had a lot of skills with hunting, fishing, whatever have you, who could hold their own in a fight. A lot of people with either with local militias, or if they are enlisting, they're enlisting with small groups of people that they knew from a certain area. And they're coming from everywhere from Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia into Alabama to wage war against the Red Stick Creek with their allies, the Creek and the Cherokee. So we have, there are War of 1812 service record indexes for Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Creek Indians who fought with Americans against the Red Stick Creek. The only ones that are online, from my understanding, on Fold 3 that are full service records, not just indexes, but the service records are for a very specific group of Chickasaw Indians on the Mississippi campaign. So they have not digitized those service records yet, which is unfortunate because I would like to see them. On FamilySearch, you'll also see Indian War Service under Alabama, under the abstracts of pension papers of soldiers of the Revolutionary War, which, no offense, if anybody has ancestors from Alabama, there's a huge, like, there's a whole list of like information for them that Alabama just basically went through and found every single veteran, and didn't matter where they were from as long as they were dying in Alabama, and had their information available on like cards, and the cards are available on FamilySearch. But we're going to go through some of these just very, very briefly. Here's one of the cards from Alabama. It's under the Revolutionary Service, or is it the Indian War Service for Alabama, 1812 to 1814, but it also includes all of Revolutionary War Service as well, and those are on the earlier cards, but they're just alphabetically. But this is still key, guys, because if you guys will notice on the bottom of the card, I know it's kind of hard to see, this information on Lot Abernathy was from a list of men who received arms at Fort Hawkins on this particular date, 1814. So, and he's from Captain Thomas Crawford's new North Carolina militia. So that's given us a couple other places to go, but we have him receiving arms at a specific place on a specific date in 1814. So this could be your linchpin of getting into a lineage society, or it could help you narrow down some other information that you would want for your research. Now, I'm going to run through, because super fast, getting a War of 1812 pension file. If you haven't, if your ancestor has a pension file and you haven't received it yet or haven't gone through it yet, I completely understand, because if your ancestor's like mine with the last name of V for Vandiver, you're going to be waiting for a while. But for everybody else who's stepping into this and says like, oh, my ancestor has a surname that goes through S, like I'm going to go through this. We're going to go through and run through it very, very quickly. This is what's in a pension file. It's what you would expect to see in a pension file we see later for the Civil War, for yes, basically for the Civil War, yeah. Even though we don't have the digitization of having all of those pensions available online yet, at least for Union soldiers, this is what you get out of the War of 1812, and it gives you a lot of really good information. Now, remember when we talked about all of those Vandivers, right? And one of them was Adam Poole Vandiver, the son of this Revolutionary War veteran. On paper, this is what he looks like, right? He's got some tax lists. He's got some census records. He's on a claimant for his mother's probate estate. Because remember, I'm doing a reasonably exhaustive search. So I even went through, probate records. I also saw him claiming his father's Revolutionary War pension file, which was a little weird. And the will book from his time period is completely missing. So there's nothing there. And then he has a probate for 1877, which is actually where I found a whole bunch of information. But but when we look at him from military records and from the military point of view, this is the information I'm able to get on him. And you'll see that it's a very, very different, meatier, dish of information that I can pull from. Because the census records, the tax lists, they're great at giving me that, yes, he's in a certain place at a certain time doing his thing, right? But here, we're actually getting to know more about the person. And also, I just happen to be very, very fortunate that the Rick Steves of the 1840s came through Tallulah Falls, where Adam Vandiver is living, and wrote essentially an article about the hunter of Tallulah. And I was going to give this presentation next month, but I wasn't sure you guys wanted to hear about the hunter of Tallulah who had over 30 children with 3 different wives, but not all at the same time, and all of his Jeremiah Johnson, Gaston, Deadpool sort of exploits. But, it's been fun knowing that I'm related to a one-eyed, gray-eyed, bearded, weasel-faced man who stood like 5 foot. I feel pretty tall and pretty good about myself. Anyway, so this is all the information I grabbed from him. And because his name is V for Vandiver, and I have to go get his pension because it's not online yet, I was actually able to see the real papers. And I would advocate that if you are going to DC for any reason, even if your ancestors' pension is digitized, go look at the originals. Because I got to hold in my hand a paper that was signed by like my 4th great grandfather. And that just doesn't happen very often. And I remember when I held this in my hand, because you can see he didn't put his mark, he actually put an A for Adam. And I knew he was probably functionally illiterate, but he didn't use an X, he used A. And I remember holding this, and I didn't want to give the paper back to the nice lady. And she, you know, she helped me put all the file back. She said, we'll take good care of it for you. And I'm like, that doesn't comfort me. But it was still pretty cool to go through all of the paperwork. So if you do get a chance to go see it in person, I highly advocate it. Now, part of the reason I got his pension was because I wanted to know more about his military service and about his disability, because part of the pension was to support people who were fundamentally disabled. From it, and you'll see in the red squares there, he basically, during his service, had the General Floyd, who he was serving under, had been shot in the leg and couldn't walk. And Adam Vandiver and another man put the general in a stretcher and then ran the general 70 miles across country to get to the nearest headquarters. And I saw this over and over and over again, how he carried a wounded General Floyd from the battleground at Atopa to Fort Mitchell. So as he explains his service over and over through all these pages, you'll see more information added as the narrative goes around. So you're not going to get it all from one paper. You actually have to go through multiple papers to find it. But he claims that his military disability is in the yellow, and he says he's totally disabled from obtaining a substance by manual labor, that he says that he's been wounded, and he was wounded from this service of carrying the general 70 miles, and that he's bedridden, and that, in our opinion, it will continue this injury will be with him for the rest of his life. Does not mention at all the, you know, the many hunting exploits that were from the article from like 3 years earlier. You know, I'm just saying, just saying. So he really did just kind of get people to vouch for him that, yeah, this guy's completely immobile, can't do anything. So was he fibbing? You'll have to listen to my Hunter of Tallulah. So we'll go through that. So moving forward, I want you guys to conduct a reasonably exhaustive search for the records that we discussed today. And it's so important to consult those non-digitized resources from the National Archives. And I know they're closed, but give them some time and put your requests in, okay? And it might take a little bit longer because they've been receiving requests, but they've been closed. So it could take a little longer unless you went in person to go get some of these resources. So go through, conduct your research at your county and state levels. Remember those adjutant generals records from the state. Go through those regimental histories and the personal accounts, and then request some help from a lineage group, because remember, we've got multiples. We've got the Continental Society of the Daughters of the Indian Wars, the General Society of the War of 1812, the Military Society of the War of 1812, and the National Society of the United Daughters of the War of 1812. So there's multiple groups for both men and women who can help you with some of your research. And they would probably love to have you as a member. I think that's always really, really nice, is to go and geek out with a bunch of people who also love the War of 1812. And I want you guys to share what you've learned. So, you know, if you're on a blog or you're on social media or you're doing research, or, you know, you want to need your group or organization needs an article, I understand you guys don't think you're the best writers, but just tell the story the way you would tell it to me. Just tell it the way you would tell a friend. You know, don't make it complicated. Just tell the story and back it up with your research. And it's going to be great. Everybody's going to love to read it. I love reading them. So send them to me. If you're worried about it, send them to me. I'll read it. And then I'll say, yeah, it looks great. And then you can send it off and have it published. So we're going to go through questions. And I apologize because there were a bunch of people who sent some questions in. So we'll go through that. So thanks, Tim, for that link. The Indian Wars. Are there any records from Mississippi? This is from F. Billerbeck. Are there any records from Mississippi? Yes, there are records from Mississippi. The question of it comes down to is, was somebody living in Mississippi at the time period, and then they moved to Mississippi later, or were they in Mississippi and then were in another state? But Mississippi does have some records. Some of them are on FamilySearch, but remember, all of those service records are also going to be on Fold 3, on Ancestry, at the National Archives. All of that stuff is the same. There were specific military engagements in Mississippi, especially with river battles and with the Indian Wars. So consult those original records and go from there. And if you need some help, let me know. So, and what was the Indian War records on FamilySearch URL address? That is in your handout. So if it's in your handout, take a look and see if it's there. Joseph said, I heard that NARA doesn't let you pull any records that aren't already online unless it's for good reason. Is that true? I've never had any problems with it. I've asked for records and they give it to me. So I haven't had a problem. But there is a huge difference between, like I think that with Civil War files, because even though I had a Civil War file and I had part of it digitized, I had part of it from like another resource where somebody had gone through, one of those history volunteers had gone through and digitized a bunch of them. I went and asked for the full pension file and I got the whole pension file. So I think that I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't really had that experience. If you have, let me know, because I can understand that they're pinched for time, but if you're able to say like, look, I think there's some files, there's some pages missing, I really can't say that they would say no. F. Fillerbeck says, in terms of questions, can you use the NARA History Hub on the website? You can ask a question and the subject matter experts will answer your question. Oh yeah, that's a really great one. Thanks. I'll add that to our little list of stuff. That sounds really good. I love the NARA History Hub. Big fan. Are there any other questions that you guys want to go through or talk about? Wow, I must have overwhelmed you. I did notice we lost like 10 people. They must have been like, oh man, I can't handle this. This is too much for me. Okay. Well, I'm going to give you guys like a couple more minutes for questions. And while you guys are getting your questions, I'm going to go through and I'm going to show you next what we've got coming up. So Becky, who emailed us a little earlier, who messaged us a little earlier, this is what we have coming up, guys. So in January, I'm sorry, no, I'm not in January, I'm in June, sorry, June. In June, I have 4 speakers coming up for next month. So all of these are free. They don't require any library cards. Just go ahead and sign up for these events. All of the events are open and ready for registration. I have Sarah Potters coming in to talk about identifying information in family photographs. I have Teresa McMillan coming in to do a case study on using collateral ancestors. I have Matt, who's coming with us from the Joliet Public Library, not too far from me. He's coming in to do a program on his book, The 1926 Orland Park Murder Mystery, which is going to be dope. And then at the end of the month for me is putting the past together with Pinterest. So super excited about this. It's all free, no library card required. Just go through, register for the event, and we'll send you the link in the handouts the day before and then an hour before the program. Remember that if you haven't already, subscribe to receive updates from our blog. I promise I will not send you an email every single day. The blog posts might go out once or twice a month, but they do have information on all of our webinars, how to register for future webinars. It'll have the videos for the previous webinars so you can watch them. And then if you've got Facebook, join our Fountaindale Public Library Genealogy Club Facebook page because that's how I'm able to share things super, super fast. Is share them right away. So Judy says, any suggestions on where to look for cartel records? My ancestor was bailed out of Dartmoor by the cartel that owned his ship. So the cartel records might be at the National Archives and they might be in Admiralty records. So Admiralty records, and some of it also may be with the prisoner exchange, Judy, from Dartmoor. I would also check in those correspondence in those state war papers, because those are super fun and those have a lot of correspondence, but they're a struggle to get through. But if you can find something about your ancestor, they'll have infinitely more information, and that will possibly include the cartel information that'll tell them like what date he's going to arrive. So I would check with American Admiralty Court records and then those state records, and see what else you can find. And contact the National Archives and see if they have them. So Crystal says, my 5th great-grandfather served on the other side of the war, according to family legend, participating in the Battle of New Orleans. Then he decided he'd rather stay here instead of going home to Scotland. Where would records be to find on his service? So that's a good question, Crystal. Crystal, if he's serving from the British, that you have a lot of options. And most of those are through the National Archives in Kew. When you go to the National Archives website in Kew, this is in London. This is not our National Archives. It's the British National Archives. So they will have a finding guide for the War of 1812. The War of 1812 military service records, they will have information how to access those records, how to request them, what's inside of them. And you can send away for them online through their portal. Now, if you're having any questions or you really need some help, let me know. Email me directly and I will send you to my friend Audrey, who's a family historian at the National Archives, and she will help you get squared away if you can't figure it out on your own. But in it, I want you guys to take a look at it, because in it are all of these guides that go along and describe all the records that are associated with those records. So it's not just looking for the military records, it provides you with all of the other records that you might want to look for. So really, really go through those, because it really gives you a lot of light of all of just the amazing minutia of British paperwork that sometimes I wish we had access to a little bit easier. Okay, so with no other questions, and I think Joseph made a comment about no library card required. That was on, well, I can't necessarily put it on my website, but on my little, in my blog, and on this page, and on the other like little things that I'm able to put on Facebook, no library card is required. So I know that they've been putting that on our just overall library website every once in a while, but yeah, it's hard, Joseph. I can't just magic. I wish I had the power to magically go on and change my website, but they don't let me do that. They just let me talk about dead people. So anyway, so you guys have been awesome today. Since I'm not seeing any other questions, you guys know how to get a hold of me, or just pop us off an email. Super happy to hear from you. And I'm super happy somebody found out about us from Twitter, because that's kind of dope. Normally Twitter is that place where all the trolls live. So the fact that we got that is pretty amazing. But thank you so much, Miss Kathy. Becky asked, am I employed at Fountaindale? Yeah, they let me do some stuff every once in a while. This is kind of cool. If you're looking at doing some help with Ancestry, Becky, don't worry about it. Either contact your local library, contact your local family history center, and then there's a bunch of tutorials. But if you just need some help, just shoot me an email. We'll get you squared away right away. So Pam, thank you, Pam. Thank you. Oh, you want to hear about Adam? Karen I still want to hear about Adam Pohl Vandiver. Karen, you're so kind. Yeah, I would love to do one on the Hunter Tallulah. I might do that one in July. We were trying really hard not to do Genealogy Club in July, but I might do Genealogy Club in July, because I wanted to do that one on that one time Martha Washington's will got stolen, because that's a great program. Yeah, Karen, I will make sure we talk about the Hunter of Tallulah. Good times. Okay, but thank you guys so much for coming to the program today.